Good morning, afternoon, or evening for all of you who are joining us today. Welcome and thank you. My name is Ed Sanez, and I'm the president and co-founder of Unlimited Viz. We are the makers of a product called tyGraph. Joining me on the call today is Mike Potter, who's our director of sales, Dean Swan, who's our director of product. Dean is a Microsoft MVP in Office apps and services. Also joining me today is John White. He's our CTO and co-founder. I also know him as our partner in crime. He's a double MVP for SharePoint and App Platform. And for those of you who are not familiar with Microsoft speak, App Platform really means SQL Server and Power BI. And also of note, Dean and I are part of a Microsoft Partners Customer Success Management Program. And that is a program that was launched in Chicago in March that allows organizations like ours to help drive digital transformation for organizations. A couple of housekeeping items. So you know, the slides as well as a copy of this recording will be available after the webinar. In terms of Q&A, this seminar should probably go for about 40 minutes or so. So we're going to have some headspace at the end to answer questions. And John and Dean are also going to be monitoring the chat window. So if you feel like just typing a question in there, we'll either answer it throughout the presentation or at the end. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors, Masthead, who provides some outstanding navigational aids and constructs to SharePoint. Their seminar was about a week ago this time. And Extranet User Manager, who provides some exceptional site provisioning and user management tools. Their seminar was just on Tuesday. Now, if you missed any of these presentations, no problem. We have them recorded, and we'll be sending out links to this event as well as the previous events so that you have them for your use or distribution. Let me tell you a little bit about tyGraph. We are a provider of reporting and analytics for Office 365. We're pretty big on data, as you can imagine. So when we talk about our company, I expect to see some visuals like graphs and maps. As you can see, our customers are domiciled in 5 continents, with the majority of our customers being in the USA, Europe, and Australia. People around the world throw around this word big data. To give you some context, we've processed over 30 billion rows of data. We are a pure Microsoft shop in that we do all of this in Azure, and we deploy our visuals using Power BI. We cover all of Office 365, and we also have some deep analytic solutions around OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, and Yammer. But before we get too deep into the product, let me tell you a little bit about why our customers use tyGraph.
Just to jump in, Ed, your slides aren't moving along.
Slides are not moving along.
Yeah, I assume that they should be.
Yeah.
Pause to
there we go. That pause button works.
All right, I'll leave you to it.
Thank you for that, John. Yeah. It would have been a very bland presentation otherwise. So there we go. Now we have maps and graphs as opposed to a nugget of gold at the top of the hour here. So I'll just let folks digest this in terms of what we are and how we present ourselves around the globe. So our focus is really on enterprises that are engaged in digital transformation, and many of you probably joining this call can really relate to that. You need to ask the question, why are businesses focused on digital transformation? And the answer, frankly, is quite simple. Digital transformation drives engagement, and that leads to efficiencies, and those efficiencies really lead to gold. I mentioned that we're part of the Microsoft CSM program. Well, that program is largely about change management. One of the underpinnings of change management is proof. For example, how do you know your strategy is working? Once you get your strategy working, what levers can you pull to help change those processes? And ultimately, what stories can you tell to demonstrate success? These are not typically, financial types of transactions, but they can really drive ROI for an organization. tyGraph was engineered not only to get the data out of Office 365 and as a footnote, it turns out to be pretty hard to do. It is also designed to surface this data in a meaningful way so that your stakeholders can spend their time acting on it instead of going and creating their own data. I'm sure all of you on the call can relate to, going and ripping things out of source systems, putting them in Excel and doing some sort of mashup to kind of try and generate an answer. What tyGraph does is eliminate that. As Nate Silver would say, we separate the signal from the noise. On screen, you have a very basic but effective strategy for success. Most new customers use tyGraph as a health check. And what that gives them is kind of, where are we at? What does current state look like? Then we take this data and we create a plan. It doesn't have to be a 3-year plan. Often short sprints can be very and highly effective. It could be an awareness campaign. It could be a lunch and learn, some training. There are all sorts of different methods. Most importantly, what we provide is that tool to measure success. Did it work? Was there a cohort of users, a group, an office, a region that worked better than another? What stories can we glean from that data that was being presented? Nothing sells the C-suite of an organization like a great success story. The problem is, with millions of rows of data coming out of Office 365, how do you quickly get to the heart of that story? You'll hear a lot about the term rich data, but these are what we classify as those pure pieces of gold that we can extract from that payload of dirt that comes out of Office 365. If we're using a mining operation metaphor, tyGraph is like that sluicing machine that will go and sluice out all the dirt and give you those nuggets of gold. Office 365 is often not organized by things like role, region, organizational hierarchy, but when we talk about reporting, those are the kind of constructs that most people relate to. How is that Southeast region doing? How is the Northwest region doing? What store is outperforming the other store? I mean, in the bigger world where we do things like same store sales year over year, things of that nature, right? Those are the types of analytics people are used to. But when they come out of Office 365, they're often not grouped that way. And where you really start to drive the value is being able to mash up this data with other sources. We even had some customers do overlays of things like sales performance relative to their data in tyGraph. How is this region doing from a sales perspective, and then how are they collaborating internally? And it got some interesting results from that. Point is, what we're doing is we're providing not only reports. Reports are things that answer the questions we already know to ask, but also analytics. That's the type of thing where we can dive in and find out questions that haven't been asked yet. Now, adoption is a bit of a double-edged sword, and it's not long before the word governance enters into the equation. So for example, we have a lot of extranet projects that we see as being blocked because those in security operations are concerned about what data is being shared and with whom, and how are they digesting it, and how is user management being handled. As a result of that, we've partnered with companies like EUM that provide those types of facilities to make it easy for those people to use the systems. And what tyGraph comes in behind with is a bit of a governance construct, because we're able to get at audit level data and monitor. So from a data loss prevention perspective, a little bit of assurance for those organizations as to how the data is being consumed. Now, one of our most popular reports is actually our benchmarking report. This is an anonymized aggregation of customer data, and it really answers the question, what does good look like? And I say it's a number one report. It really is, because this is often what's discussed in the C-suite. So your CXOs of the organization are coming in and saying, okay, well, this is great. This is how we're doing internally, but how does that compare with other organizations? And let me tell you, I've seen firsthand how this bragging rights and motivation can really drive some success by making your organization better than those on the benchmark list. One caveat to this is currently only available in our tyGraph for Yammer product, but we're looking to extend that to other workloads. So now I'm going to gear shift a little bit and talk about what ships out of the box from Microsoft. And I guarantee you, your CFO, the first thing they're going to ask is, why do I need tyGraph when I can get this free from Microsoft? And to be fair, there's some very good value in what is shipping out of the box. And depending on your strategy, it may be good enough for what you need. So for those of you who are not familiar with usage analytics, they can be found in two places. First is the Admin Center, and second is in Power BI via a content pack. As you can see on the screen, you need a specific level of privilege to get at it. You can either be a global admin in one of the workloads or across all of Office 365, or they've introduced, as about a year ago, something called a report reader where you don't have to be a global admin, but you can be extended out to read these reports. And what you get is, artifacts around user adoption, funnel data, how people are being, using the system, as well as some Azure Active Directory attributes, company, location, department, and title. The caveat there, of course, is to make sure that those are actually populated in your Office 365 or your Azure tenant space. Oftentimes they're not. And then, of course, you can do custom report creation beyond what comes from some of the standard reports. One thing you'll come to learn very quickly is this term of PreAggregation. So what they're doing is they're taking the data and based on typically time horizons, pre-aggregating it together. And the reason for this is very simple. There's just simply too much data emanating out of the Office 365 system for Microsoft to collect and hold it all. As I mentioned, we processed about 30 billion rows of data. Imagine Microsoft has 400,000 customers using Office 365. Can you imagine the amount of data that's coming out of there? They just physically can't do it. So again, to be clear, for some use cases, just knowing directional trends and rolling 3 months, rolling 12 months, that sort of thing, may be good enough for what you're trying to do. So let's dive into it just a little bit more deeply. So I've given you a couple of screenshots. This is actually from our tenant space. This is SharePoint, and it's from the admin portal. So this is not in Power BI. And what you get are what you would expect, some very simple reports that are reasonably static in nature. So you have 7, 30, 90, and 120 days. Sorry, try that again. 7, 30, 90, and 180 day slicers across the top. As you can see, you have the option of looking at, in the context of SharePoint, files, pages, and users. So you can see activity across those. And there's an export button on any one of these pages so that you can export this data into Excel. And then, and this becomes a little bit more rich, you have data that is built in pre-built reports in Power BI. So because it's in Power BI, you have the choice of using the reports in their current form and incarnation, or going and either taking those reports and extending them, or taking those reports against the data model that is shipping and creating your own reports. One caveat, of course, is that this is currently shipping in what's known as a content pack. And as a result of that, you're limited to the data set that exists in that environment. You cannot extend it. So for example, if your Active Directory doesn't have role, region, organizational structure, and you want to slice by those elements, you can't. You have to get them into Active Directory or find some other mechanism to do it. You cannot extend these reports. One other thing is that content packs themselves are going away, so just expect that there will be a bit of a transition with regard to how Microsoft is delivering this. This was just announced in August, and so the plans for what Microsoft will be shipping next will be forthcoming. I expect to hear some of that at the Ignite conference next week. So now, without further ado, I'm going to jump into a demonstration of our product and show you some of the things that you can get. So for those of you that are reasonably technical on the call, I'll go a little bit deep and then shallow it up for the rest of us. This is using the reporting API. So the reporting API is what feeds the adoption content pack, or now known as the Microsoft Usage Analytics. And so we're reading very much the same data. We do it a little bit differently in that we're gathering the data every day as opposed to 7-day, 30-day slices of the data. So one of the things that we've engineered is the ability to go in and iterate through the data that comes out on a daily basis and put it into a data model so that we can visualize this to customers. One of the things that we really like to do is do things like workload overlays. So for example, how is Teams doing relative to Yammer, relative to email? And the $1,000,000 question that always gets asked is, does email go down if I start using these other workloads? And I can tell you the answer to the $1,000,000 question, and the answer is no. Email seems to be just trucking along at its own vector. However, we have seen some good adoption of some of these other workloads. Again, some very basic information with regard to SharePoint, some gas gauges on how things are using email, Teams, Yammer, and Skype. We also provide you some information with regard to Office 365 groups. So these could be Exchange groups, they could be groups that are attached to Teams, they could also be groups that are attached to other workloads, now including Yammer as an example. But at the end of the day, what these are is SharePoint site collections, if you will, with one level to them. And what we're doing is tracking, things like item growth, how your storage is working. This is one that's tracked quite frequently, which is kind of your group proliferation. There's a governance word again. You start launching things that are really good, people adopt them, and all of a sudden it explodes. And so now you have a new problem, not adoption, but governance. But this gives you an understanding of how those are working. On any one of our visuals, we typically have a time slicer, so we can take a look at what this looks like over a different period of time, or you can pick specific date ranges and so on and so forth. We get into licensing. So, how is your Office 365 usage working for you, or perhaps not? For example, who's been provided a Power BI Pro license, and conversely, who's actually using it? So which devices have they been activated on? Things of that nature. I'll move on to SharePoint Sites. Again, this is fairly shallow relative to what I'm about to show you with our audit level data. But this is what's coming out of the reporting API. So I can see, site usage. We do also have some drill down features with regard to our reporting. So we might want to look, month by month, what our SharePoint site activity is looking like, kind of storage used over time, files and activities and so forth, page views, and getting down into both the site activity as well as the content activity. Then we analyze users, and we can do so and provide a bit of a map visualization for how user activity is being driven. Again, if I take a look at a specific time period as opposed to years, I want to go down to months. I can see how my activity is being broken out over time. We do other things like provide slicers against users. So if you have a large number of users, it's a little bit like a telephone book. We can sort this by department. So if I want to look at management versus the rest of the departments, again, feeding from Active Directory, this is not including a data mashup. The next report we have is for Teams. So for anybody who has started down the Teams road, again, these are fairly light analytics in regard to Teams. Next week at Ignite, we're going to be announcing a whole new product for Teams specifically, which gives us some very deep analytics. But you can take a look at how chat messages are working, meetings, private messages, calls. And then we start to extend the data a little bit, looking at things like working out loud score. So what does that mean? So what we're doing is we're taking a look at how people are communicating. Are they doing private chats, or are they chatting within Teams channels more publicly? And the idea here is that as people work out loud more, we have a better communications channel and path, and you really get that organization working closer and better together. OneDrive usage. not dissimilar to what we're doing with the groups, because again, OneDrive is at its heart very much a SharePoint container, site collection specific to the user. To use the old SharePoint term, it's kind of your my site for all of your Office 365 files and so forth. So, again, usage over time. For those of you who are using Yammer, we provide a very light view as to what's going on with Yammer Analytics. As an example, this particular report has 16 signals, and our Yammer Analytics Deep Analytics tool has over 200. So it gives you a bit of a spectrum in terms of what we're being able to do. But things like reads, likes, and posts, so vector analysis, as well as how people are consuming Yammer from a device perspective, and then top users. And again, the measure for that is just basic activity. But there are other ways to manage user activity. Finally, email, and a little bit of a war story on this one. We started down the road of actually doing exploration into people's email boxes and calendars. What we found, two things. One is that it became very creepy very fast, and organizations just completely backed off of that. And then secondly, Microsoft has Workplace Analytics, which is a tool that is used to analyze both email and calendar and drive some insights into how people are working inside of an enterprise. So our idea is to fill the gap on things that don't exist in market today. So we're not going to go and build products around something that Microsoft is shipping out of the box. And then finally, Skype. Again, this is Skype Online. So for those people that are using on-premises servers, this would not be captured, but we have a lot of information in regard to how Skype is being used. This report obviously will transform over time as Skype becomes Teams, and Skype will start to become deprecated in market. So we expect some changes to that over the next, say, year to 18 months. Now I'm going to transition over to SharePoint. And as I mentioned in our Pulse product, our SharePoint analytics are actually fairly light relative to what we can get with regard to our tyGraph for SharePoint product. And first of all, we'll talk a little bit about how what you see on the screen here. So, site collections that are actually in use. So of our 203 site collections, we have 91 that are in use. And for those of you in the SharePoint sphere, I mean, SharePoint has two great things. One is people put a lot of content into it, and secondly, they forget about all the content they put into it, and they never prune it out. So one of the things that we've looked to do is help organizations understand what's in there, and perhaps what shouldn't be in there, and how to prune it out. And then again, site usage, internal users versus external users, as well as guest users. So if usage has been turned, or sorry, external usage has been turned on, again, one of the guardrails that we put up for organizations is the ability to identify guest users and what content they're actually consuming. Some telemetry data around file activities, page activities, and sharing. So each one of these, we're trying to cram a lot of information into a very small space here. So each one of these columns is actually a pivot. So if somebody came to you and says, well, how much, or what's using the most space in our facility, how many people are sharing things out, what has the most page activity, what has the most file activity, you can simply hit any one of these headings and drill down to it. Again, this is the corpus of all of our site collections. And as you can see, some of these site collections are of different origins. So, groups being the classic Exchange, I guess classic, maybe 2 years old, classic Exchange group, or perhaps a Teams group, as well as, and then this is true classic, the actual team sites. So we monitor, as you can see, the different types of sites or different types of site templates that are being used. And one of the things that I can do, knowing that this is a team site and it likely has some subsites to it, I can go directly into site detail for that site. So within this, I'll just put this into focus mode. I can see all of the various subsites and which ones have activity and conversely which ones don't. So we also do little things like provide helpers. So the link URL to that specific site, we can get at that. And then over to the far right here, we have this activity slicer. So this is something that organizations just frankly fall in love with really quickly. So we can do things like pages viewed. So this will show me all the pages viewed, and I want to do activity over time. So right now, from the 13th of June backwards, and I can, again, put this into focus mode, I can see all of the paths for all of the people that viewed all of the sites in a chronological order, or I can sort this by site collection, or I can sort this by path. So this gives me some insight into pages viewed. The other thing that I can do though is look at, so who's been deleting files in my site collection. John, big offender here, over 1,000 files deleted, and all very valid. All very valid, right, John?
Absolutely.
But as you can see here are all the files that John deleted, and time and date stamped in terms of when they were done. And I can also take a smaller slice of time and see, John hasn't deleted much in a smaller slice of time. But I can also do things like files downloaded, when things were modified, and then other things like, sharing inheritance was broken in the site collection. That's a big one for organizations. So I might want to drill down on, kind of where that was done. Oh, that was me. So these are the types of things that you can very, very quickly get some answers to within your SharePoint environment. Of course, the standard telemetry data around top users, top files, top pages, and then if you sorted this, you can go to least used users and pages and files. Let me just roll back now and show you another visualization using the same data. So now I'm scoped to all site collections. So my filter has been turned off. I can then go and specify a specific site collection. But what you'll also notice over here is this activity vector has really increased. So, I only had sharing for one item shown here. Now there's a whole number of different sharing scenarios that have been put forward. So sharing invitations created, sharing invitations that have been accepted, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that we're capturing audit level data. There's about 96 of these activities that we track from the Office 365 environment to pull this in. So to do this, not trying to blow our own horn here, this is not a trivial effort. I'll give you an example. We have one organization, only 2,000 employees. We have some organizations with over 100,000 employees. So, 2,000 is a relative number. The audit buckets that we have to open to get this data is about 1.4 million to go and harvest that out. So again, it's not a trivial thing to do. And I would think I would go on record as safely saying we're the only ones that do this, because I haven't run into anybody that does it quite like us. Now the coveted inactivity of sites. So we have a slicer here with most recent activity. So show me everything that's not had been touched in 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, or why don't we just say over a year? So a couple of things, we do things like provide the email link, so I can click on this and directly message Andre and say, hey, look, your site hasn't been touched in over a year. I can go to that site itself. I can go to the site settings page, and if I don't want to even tell Andre, I might blow it away myself. But the idea here is that we'll give you some good ways to work with your data in a very real and practical way. Again, filters by site collection or filters by the type of template that are used. And of course, being able to go and prune your sites over time. The final report in this is it come to us from a number of customer requests, really trying to better understand file sync activity. And the reason for this is users have been, syncing. They see the new "Hey, sync now" button in SharePoint. They pull down a whole bunch of data onto their machine. They realize, oh, I'm running out of disk space, and they start nuking files locally from their machine, not realizing that they're in full sync status. And if they don't have the more modern sync client on their tool with Windows 10, there's no ability to kind of have some files live in Office 365 but only have the stub available to them on the desktop. So as they start deleting files, it deletes it from the kernel system. So you're ending up with a bit of a repair problem on your hands. The idea here is that really understand who's actually performing these sync activities, and then making sure we get some comms to them around that type of thing. And in our tyGraph for OneDrive product, I'll show you a little bit more about that. So now I'm transitioning over to tyGraph for OneDrive. You'll notice some very you notice a lot of similarities between this and what we're doing with our SharePoint product, because again, OneDrive really at its core is really a SharePoint container. So again, file activities, the ability to look at file activities over time, OneDrive users, so I can go again pick on John here because he's always fun to pick on. And he also has just a massive corpus of files. John's an avid photographer, and one of the things that he does is store all his raw images in OneDrive. But this is somebody who's not part of our organization, so let's take a look at what Eric has been doing in John's OneDrive. And as we see here, Eric and John were collaborating on a conference together. And we can see when the access to that OneDrive container was created, when it was accepted, and all of the activities that happened within this time frame between John and Eric. So again, we can get very granular in regard to understanding what's going on within that file system. And then file storage, again, really understanding, kind of what our storage mechanisms look like. Again, John is completely off the charts with regard to the amount of data that's being stored, and he's only 50% of his usage quota. Again, people slicers here, so if I want to filter down by first name or get to John and so on and so forth, I can do that with the slicer. A few of the other gas gauges that we have on the top, number of OneDrives that are being used relative to the ones that are deployed, how active are the files, and then the amount of capacity that's used. Again, large organizations, these are the types of things you really want to keep an eye on. And then file types in terms of the OneDrive content. So we've had use cases where people want to show me all the images, show me all the video files, show me all the documents. Again, all of these reports are cross-filterable, so I can go in and take a look at top activities around documents versus video files versus image files. And as I explained with John doing all those raw images are through the roof in our context. And then finally, sync activities. Similar to what I was speaking to in regard to what's going on with SharePoint, similarly with OneDrive. The other thing that we've seen very frequently is, tell me what's, if somebody has a problem with their sync client. Now that's physically we're not able to do that. That would be more of an Intune type of thing. But what we can do is really kind of understand, when things were last accessed, and then kind of what's being synced and so on and so forth. So we can give you a lot of data around sync activities. And then finally, sharing activities. Show me all things, and this is pre-filtered to things that have been shared outside the firewall and how they've been accessed. And then, this one's always interesting. If we're talking about anonymous accesses, we really want to make sure that anything that's been published anonymously is fine. In this case, we're talking about John's seminars. that he puts out on his OneDrive, as he's going from city to city doing speaking engagements. So, all of these look very good, but we may want to scour this and take a look for anything that's potentially untoward. And then finally, we have our tyGraph for Yammer product. It could take 45 minutes to an hour to go through ourselves, but the idea here is that we're getting well beyond just telemetry data. So we have concepts like influencers, who's actually driving the needle in the network. This is one of the things that we're taking across multiple workloads like into Teams and really understanding, who's influencing my network. It's not just, who's most active. It is oftentimes, how people are following you and how people are consuming and how people are reacting to your content, so on and so forth. So those are the types of things that that we do to really help organizations better understand what's going on in their enterprise. And then other things like threat impact. So really understanding kind of what are the things that are driving the organization, and what are the good stories? As I mentioned, in the C-suite, we always want to come out with really good stories to tell people. That threat impact is something where we can go draw out stories based on an algorithm that we think are high potential. And if you're dealing with thousands, tens of thousands, and even into millions of messages in a day that are going through your Office 365 network, kind of trapping those and highlighting what we think is really hot and trending is something that would be very hard without this. And I'll finish up here. We also have, as you've noticed, I've been running in Power BI this whole time. We also have Power BI, what's called embedded. So it is a web site, web experience for those people who don't want to get into analytics. They just show me the numbers, give me the reports. This is your solution. So what we do is we put this out to organizations, and you can have multiple reports. As you can see here, I've got a pulse report, I've got a group admin report. We also ship things like data dictionary as well as our benchmarking data, all through this user interface. So it's a little bit easier for the end stakeholder who's not a data analyst to be able to consume. You simply go to the website, log in with your corporate credentials, and away you go. So I'm going to pause there and ask if there are any questions. As I mentioned, we take about 40 minutes of time, and we're at that mark right now. So if anybody has any questions. John, are you monitoring the question window?
Yeah, we're able to go back and forth on the chat, but I have yet. Apparently, Dean's figured out how to answer a question in here, but I haven't. So
okay, Dean.
Yeah, sure. So we've had some good questions from Peter and Karen. We answered in the chat window. Karen's question was, how can the email sent receive ratio be so low? And the answer there, Karen, as I put in the window, we're a relatively small company. We get a lot more email than we send, and we typically use Teams to communicate amongst ourselves. So that's, and you're looking at our data, so that's part of the reason there. So great question. The other questions that were part of the chat were regarding how far back do we go?
Great question.
As John, so as John and I answered in the chat, and it's interesting how we both answered the questions at the same time, because we didn't realize that we were both doing that. So, but in any case, for our tyGraph for SharePoint, tyGraph for OneDrive, we go back 7 days, and that is due to the constraint of what is available to us through the management API. Now, the benefit of going with tyGraph is we get all that information on a day forward basis. Now, that's the smallest window of time that we collect. For our tyGraph Pulse product, we go back 26 days. And again, the beauty there is we get information on a daily basis, not in an aggregated way as you would with the usage analytics solution. And then finally, with our tyGraph for Yammer product, for most of the data, we go back to the genesis of your network. So I think that takes care of all the questions, although Karen had a great, another Karen, really liked your comment regarding email. It became very creepy very fast.
Indeed.
And then this, I was just going to say, this is for Logan, or there was someone asking about, Othman was asking about a presentation for the 18th and half of today, and they're looking for a link to the presentations, and his or her email's right there in the question box. So we'll be sure to get you those links.
And there's one more question that just come in. Kurt asks if there's any information available for Planner. I can answer that. Unfortunately, no, not at the moment. Planner doesn't send any signals through the management API. We're waiting on that.
It is planned, by the way, not to have a play on words, but we definitely see it in the documentation. It's just not available currently.
And that's it.
That's it for questions. All right. Well, we're going to wrap here, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. If you're participating in Ignite at all, on premises, we will be there with a booth. So please feel free to drop by. In addition, for those of you who are not participating in Ignite, you can also participate online because they're going to be streaming, I believe, all of the different presentations. So looking forward to next week. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we'll get you the links to everything from today. Take care.